While creating applications using PHP, if you have come across a database, you have likely worked with CRUD operations. Wanna know what CRUD operations are? Well, they are widely used along with SQL. And as every developer knows, SQL is pretty prominent in the development community. But a few struggle in understanding how CRUD operations work. So that's the reason why I'm conducting this session today. Hey everyone, and welcome to Simplilearn. And today we are discussing everything about CRUD operators in PHP. Let's begin with the definition first. CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. These are the four fundamental functions of persistent storage. These operators are used in creating user interface conventions that help us to view, search, and modify data via computer-based forms and reports. Basically, the data is read, built, updated, and deleted. Moving forward, let me talk about the purpose of these operations one by one with the help of demo codes. But first things first, let's create a database. To do that, open XAMPP control panel and start Apache and MySQL. Now let's quickly open our web browser, open the local host and go to PHP MyAdmin section. Now let's create a new database and name it MyDB. Let's name the table users and we will have 6 fields in it. The first would be ID. It would be integer and auto-incremented since it would be the primary key. The second would be first name, type varchar, let's give it 250. The third would be last name, variable character. Similarly, next would be an email, password, and finally gender. So now that our table has been created, let's move on to the coding part. Now first we are going to create a file named config.php to configure the database. Now we will create variables and I will explain the use to you later. This is the default username for a local host. Now the default password for a database is empty since there is no password in a database. And the database name would be MyDB. That's what we have named our database. Now let's quickly create the connection using con variable MySQLi command server name, username, password, and the database name. Now this will create a connection for our database. And now let's also check for errors while creating the database. Now, if an error is found while connecting to the database, it will show a message as connection failed. Now let's end the file and move on to understanding the different CRUD operations. Now first comes create. So let us also create a new file and name it create.php. Now the create procedure adds the insert statement to create a new record. Now let's write the code for this. Now what this line will do is it will act as a link between the configuration.php file and this create.php to connect to the database. Now we are checking if the submit button on the form is pressed. Now when the submit button on the form will be pressed, the fields are required to be sent to the database. So for that, we first need to create different variables. Similarly, last name, these are the names that we have given to the different sections in the table of our database. Password was password, and finally gender. Now let's write the SQL query to enter the data into our table. For that we need to insert into the name of the table, that is users, and now we need to name the fields we are going to be entering the details into. Since ID is auto-incremented, we are going to be starting with first name, similarly last name, email, password, and lastly gender. Now these are the fields we are going to be entering data into. Now the values would be the variables that we've just created, which are getting the data from the form using the post function into the variables. So first name, similarly last name, email, password, and gender. So the code to enter the values into the database is complete. Now let's also execute the query. To do that, we will send the query using the connect and put the attribute as SQL fields. Now, if the records are created, it will display a successful message. Else, in case of an error, it will show an error message. Now let's close the connection using the close function and move on to creating our HTML form. Now let's give a heading here. Now since this is a registration page, let's give the heading as sign up form and create the form. Let's leave the action field as blank and method would be, since we're using post, the method would be post. Now I'll just skip ahead with this form part. Now as you can see, I've completed the code for the registration form, which will include the first name, last name, password, and gender. Now let's save it and move on to the next part, that is the view procedure. Now the view procedure table records data based on the primary key noted within the input parameter. Now let's create another file named view.php for it and write its code. Now I will run the entire code in a single go and explain how these different CRUD operations are working on the web page. Now let's write the query to get the data from the users table. From users, now this will retrieve all the data from the table. Also, let us execute the query using connect query and pass SQL into it, and the PHP script, and write our HTML code. The title would be view page. Now I'm linking this page to a Bootstrap CSS document to make it look somewhat stylish, since basic HTML page looks pretty boring. Now to do that, we are going to be using the reference, and I have added the link for the CSS file. Now let's complete the rest of the page. We are heading to this division, users. Now this will also display the ID from a table. So we are going to be creating a different set of column to display the ID. Similarly, it will be the same for the rest of the fields. So I'll just copy this code. This will be for email, gender, and editor. Email, gender, and action. Let's close it. Let's put it on the next line. So this will check if there is data present in our database. Now if there is data, we are going to be fetching the same data Similar codes will be written for the rest of the fields. So we will let me just copy and paste and change the details. First name, last name, email, and gender. These are the codes for the edit and delete commands. And finally, let us close the page. Now let's quickly move on to the third part, update file, and write its code. Now, when the update button for the form is clicked, we need this code to process it. And similarly for the rest of the fields, let's quickly change user ID. This would be ID, last name, all of our variables are complete. Now let's write the query for the SQL. Update name of the table, users, and set first name is equals to first name, and similarly for the rest of the code. Now let's execute the query. Pass SQL to it. Again, if the record is a successful updation, pass successful message, and if any error has occurred, we will give an error message for it. Now, if ID variable is set in the URL, we know that we need to edit a record. To do that, we will again write a code using get method Now we will write SQL command to get the data. And execute a query. This is a very similar code to what we have written earlier. To fetch the data if the number of rows is greater than 0. Now what I am going to do is I am going to also skip ahead for the code for this update form. Now this is the code for the update form. And now last but not the least, we will create the file for delete and write a code very similar to how we have written the rest of the codes. Let's write the SQL query, the same old routine. So as you guess, I'm going to be skipping ahead with some part of the code. Now this is the code for our delete.php file, and now we will save all these files and go to a browser and try to check if they run correctly. Now let's open the localhost first and go to phpMyAdmin and open our users field here. So as you can see, I've already created a record here. I'll create another one to show you how. For that, let's go to localhost, demo, and go to create.php. So second record, let's name it map x. Simplilearn b. Now the email would be mapx@simplylearnb.com. Password and submit. New record created successfully. Now let's refresh it, and as you can notice, we have created another record here. Now let's go to localhost again, and what was our next operation for CRUD? It was create our read, that would be view.php. Now view.php displays both of the records that we have saved in our database. Now these number differences would be because I have created and deleted 2 more records before recording this part of the video. Now let's go to edit section of any of these records. So as you may notice, it opens the update.php file, user update form. Also, the thing to notice is that it refers to the ID that we are updating in the URL itself. Now, since we clicked on the edit part of the first field, it is updating the first field itself. Now, let's update it. Miss xxxxx abc@xyz.com and update. Record updated successfully. Now let's check the record, and yes, the record is updated. Now since we are done with the 2 parts, create, read, and even the third part, update CRU, Now let's move on to the D, that is delete. Let's go to the delete. For that, we would have to go to the view.php itself. Now, let us delete this second field, macx Simplilearn B, macx@simplilearnb.com. Delete. Now, you may notice the URL delete.php id 4. Now, id equals to 4 is deleted from the database. Let's check. And yes, the file from the database has been deleted. So this is how we perform our CRUD operations with the help of PHP and MySQL database. So thank you guys for watching. Hope it was an interesting video. Please give a thumbs up and also subscribe to Simplilearn. Stay safe and keep learning.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.